Hello students and welcome back to Sociology of Work, and we are in week 6. Semester is moving along very quickly and I hope everyone is doing well, and I'll be happy to talk to you about anything related to the class or work or politics. There is your first essay, which is due on Wednesday. So if you have any questions before you submit that, please let me know. So this week we're going to discuss a couple issues. I'm going to focus on one in particular in this lecture, and the reading will focus on the other, and there is a strong connection between the two. One of the things we do when we start elevating our intellectual thinking skills is to begin to make connections between the whole and the parts. And so when we observe that there are certain things happening in the workplace, we may ask also whether it's a function of something larger that's taking place politically, economically, in our society. And so that takes us to the question of neoliberalism. By the way, I would say that this is one of the most important concepts for any educated human being to understand if they are going to have any understanding of what the hell has been going on in major capitalist industrial societies over the last 30 years. And that's what I want to emphasize in my lecture. Now, the other part of this is precarious work. You're reading 2 chapters from a book that was written relatively recently. This is the book. You're reading the first 2 chapters, and it's written by Arnie Kalberg. Arnie Kalberg is a sociologist, former president of the American Sociological Association, and he's been studying occupations and work and labor issues for many, many years. And he wrote a book some time ago called Good Jobs and Bad Jobs. And that was the beginning of this discussion of precarious work. By the way, the term the precariat or precarious work did not exist 10 or 15, let's say 15 years ago. So this is a concept that was created, invented, manufactured as a way to understand how work had changed significantly, and particularly under the neoliberal political economic system, which I'm going to talk about. And what I want to emphasize is how the neoliberal political economic regime that currently exists in the United States emerged. And I'm going to do this presenting a kind of neo-Marxian framework, and I'm going to associate the rise of these various political economic regimes, if you like, in the United States in contemporary times, to the way in which the economy is organized and the crises of the capitalist system. That's the key connection here. So much of what you need to know about precarious work you will be getting from the reading in chapter 1 of that book that I just mentioned. But I want to provide a broader outline of neoliberalism, the rise of neoliberalism, which is one of the most significant contributing factors to the rise of precarious work. So again, as we do, as sociologists do, we put things in a larger context. All right, let's get started. And of course, my slides are not moving until I touch that. Let's see. There we go. Okay, one thing I wanted to return to, because this was the last slide of the presentation from last week and I didn't get to it. I thought I was done because I forgot that I had added this, because I wanted to give recognition to one of the great thinkers, critical social scientists, if you like, David Graeber. He's kind of an economic anthropologist. He wrote, I should say, on a whole range of issues. And he passed away unexpectedly and tragically in 2020 He was in Europe. I think he was in Britain. In any case, he came down with something. He went into the hospital. Anyway, one thing led to another. It was quite a shock to those who follow his excellent, critical, insightful, I would say iconoclastic work. And we're going to miss him dearly. He wrote one of the best books on debt, the history of debt. There's a nice piece he's written on the nature of bureaucracy, which I think is a free PDF that you can find online. And one of the more recent books that he wrote with the great title, Bullshit Jobs. And this obviously has some relevance for the sociology of work. And it's a long analysis in that book. I have a link at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide if you want to read an article he wrote, which kind of summarizes his argument that he makes in much broader, sophisticated, intricate detail in Bullshit Jobs, the book. But the point is, we have all kinds of technological advances. He talks about that. He says, but rather than allowing a massive reduction of working hours to free the world's population to pursue some of their own projects, some of their own pleasures, some of their own visions, ideas, human striving, we've seen a ballooning of not even so much of the service sector as the administrative sector. And he goes on to talk about the kind of jobs that have been generated in large numbers over the last 30 years. That point, it's as if someone were out there making up pointless jobs just for the sake of keeping us all working. So this is certainly food for thought. And one of the things he was doing and kind of triggered his interest in this topic is he put out a survey. He asked people, he said, what kind of work do you do? Then he asked them, how happy are you with your work and that kind of stuff. If your job disappeared, it's a question he asked them. If your job disappeared tomorrow, would it make any difference? Would society be any less, would it have any negative impact on the operation of society? Would anyone miss your job if it was gone, right? That kind of thing. And he found that large numbers of people indicated that the jobs they had were, they seemed a kind of meaningless work. And they even admitted that if their job had, would disappear, it would not have any negative implications for the operation of society, for the health of society, etc. So you need to think about this just in a critical sense. Many of you will get a college degree. You'll go out and try to find work. It's not going to be easy to find a job. It wasn't easy before the pandemic. It's not going to be easy now. It's going to be more difficult. There's going to be high rates of unemployment. And people are going to be taking jobs for the sake of taking a job, not necessarily because it's a job they want, not because they think it's meaningful, not because it's satisfying any kind of self-actualization, if we can use that term, from Maslow's need hierarchy. Rather, it's a means of survival. Okay, so check out his work. And I want to, recognize his contribution because rest in peace, rest in power, David Graeber. Okay. All right, so I want to talk about the rise of neoliberalism, but you can't do this without putting it in a much broader historical, political, economic context. And I'm going to do this by beginning to talk a little bit about the nature of capitalism. I've talked about this before at the beginning of the semester. What are the necessary conditions for capitalism? We talked about you have to have a working class, you have to have a proletariat, you have to have somebody to exploit. Capitalism is based on capitalists exploiting workers. That's the nature, fundamental nature of the system. Many people don't highlight that aspect of it. I do, and critical theorists do as well. But there are two other necessary conditions for capital expansion, capital growth, what capitalists call capital accumulation. If you hear that term, that's a kind of Marxian term to describe the expansion and the growth of capitalism within a national economy. And you can also talk about capital accumulation at the global level. But I'm going to focus on the national economy. So there's two necessary conditions that have to be met in order for capitalism to grow and expand. One is the capacity to produce. You can think of this as a supply side, if you like, because we're going to make some reference to those concepts as well. The capacity, you have to have a capacity to produce. What does that mean? It means that there must be conditions that exist in your society that encourage capitalists who have the capital, who have the financial resources to invest. And they have to want to invest, anticipating that they will receive a sufficient return on their investment. So you can think of the capacity to produce, this is a more common term, the business climate. Is there a favorable business climate that would encourage capitalists to take the money and the resources and the finance capital that they possess and invest it in production, in employment, in factories, in machines, etc., which is what is the basis for the expansion of the economy. If capitalists perceive that conditions are negative, they might not invest. And if they don't invest in a capitalist economy, since they own the means of production and they control finance, capital, used to make productive investments, we all get screwed. This is one of the, I would say, indictments of a capitalist system. That is, we are all dependent on the perception by capitalists that they can make a profit. If they don't have the perception they can make a profit, not just any profit, a sufficient level of profit, they won't invest their money, the economy will slow down, we will all pay the price. Even though we didn't decide that we didn't want to work, but if the capacity to produce is not attractive, does not encourage investment, the economy will go into stagnation, recession, unemployment, negative growth, etc. So you have to have a capacity to produce. On the other hand, this is key, you also have to have a capacity to consume. And what that means is, if capitalists are going to be spending their time and energy and resources producing goods, anticipating that they can make a profit because the capacity to produce is attractive, the business climate is positive, they also have to be able to, after they produce those goods, sell them. You cannot realize the profit that's embedded in goods that are produced cheaply if there's nobody to buy them. The exchange of the commodity for money, that is the realization of profit in the sphere of consumption. So there has to be a capacity to consume, right? These are two absolutely necessary conditions for capitalist economies to thrive, grow, expand, accumulate. And if you understand these two necessary requirements, you can understand a lot about the political economic system of capitalism. This opens a window into much of the dynamic of capitalism. And politics. Okay, so I'm sharing some very valuable, theoretical, conceptual material with you. Now, here's the key contradiction. The capacity to produce, if you have a good capacity to produce, a positive business climate, capitalists want wages to be as low as possible. They want costs to be as low as possible. If costs are low, they make an investment, they anticipate greater profit. If costs are high, they anticipate less profit. So on the one hand, the capacity to produce encourages low wages, reducing costs, so capitalists anticipate a profit. On the other hand, the capacity to consume requires higher wages. You see the contradiction here. How do you work out this balance between the capacity to produce, reducing costs dramatically, including wages, and the capacity to consume, which requires that people actually have a sufficient amount of money to buy all the crap and the goods and the commodities that are being produced by capital? It's a fundamental contradiction. When I teach my class on social change and international development, we talk about this contradiction actually is one way to understand the drive toward offshoring, outsourcing, and globalization. And we're going to touch on that. Okay, so we're going to get to that. So you see there is this fundamental contradiction. Capitalists want wages to be as low as possible on the one hand to anticipate a higher level of profit from their investment. On the other hand, they also need people to have wages to buy this stuff. The ideal situation actually for a capitalist would be that their workers were paid nothing. Like I'm an individual capitalist, right? My workers are paid nothing. Let's say I own them. Let's say it's slave labor. I pay them nothing. Therefore, everything I'm producing is going to be produced at the lowest possible cost. I can anticipate huge profit. On the other hand, I want every other capitalist to pay their workers well. You understand? I pay my workers nothing so I can maximize my profit, but in order to realize the profit, I have to sell them, so all the other capitalists will be paying their workers more. Think about that in the context of where most of what we consume today is produced and how much people are paid, and where it is actually sold and consumed. We're going to have more to say about that. All right. So, there are two different kinds of crises that emerge in capitalism within the framework that I'm presenting here today. Okay, one is called the demand-side crisis. Demand-side crisis. This is when capital, the capitalist class, is really strong, is really powerful, is able to impose their wishes, and they keep wages as low as possible. But the problem is wages are so low that what's sometimes called the wage squeeze. You have this wages are so low that there's lots of production, there's lots of the anticipation of profit, but there is insufficient demand. A demand-side crisis is when the population lacks sufficient amount of money to buy, spend, consume the goods and services that are available. That will create a demand-side crisis. A supply-side crisis is different. That's when labor is relatively strong, well-organized, powerful, able to bargain for higher wages, raise wages, benefits, all of those kinds of things, right? So when labor is strong, wages go up, right? But the capacity to produce is weak because now the business climate isn't as favorable, right? And so rather than a crisis generated by the insufficient amount of money in the hands of workers, this is a crisis generated by the reluctance of, the decision by capitalists not to invest, we call this disinvestment, because they're going through what is sometimes called a profit squeeze because the workers are organized and getting a bigger piece of the pie and squeezing the profits. And the capitalists say, I'm not going to invest my money under these conditions because I'm not making a sufficient profit. So you can have a demand-side crisis, okay, where the capital is really strong, labor is relatively weak, and a supply-side crisis where labor is relatively strong in relationship to capital. All right. So let's talk about the Great Depression. Okay. Now, the Great Depression, millions of books have been written about it. I'm going to talk about it very quickly. The point is that the Great Depression was, within the framework that I'm laying out here, a demand-side crisis. What that means is that during that point in history, the capacity to produce was very, very healthy. You had a huge labor surplus from massive immigration from Europe. You had no organized labor, so workers weren't organized into unions. And you had the introduction of new technologies like the assembly line, which could produce large quantities of commodities in a very short amount of time. Labor surplus, no unions, technologies expanding the level of productivity. All of these were conditions which encouraged capital. This looks great, okay? We can produce lots of stuff very cheaply and massive amounts of money, lots of speculation invested in the production of goods. But what was the problem? Okay, it's a demand side crisis. The problem was wages were too low. And so all the stuff that was being produced with the anticipation that there would be high levels of profit, if it were sold, couldn't be sold because the workers' wages were too low. During that period, that was a demand-side crisis. How do you get out of a demand-side crisis? How did we get out of a demand-side crisis? Well, it took some time. Much of it happened under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for those of you who know. And it is organized around what is now called the New Deal, a whole series of policies and legislation that were based on a particular kind of political economic philosophy known as Keynesianism, Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, he basically anticipated that capitalist economies would go through these kinds of crises, and those crises required that the government, the state, expand spending dramatically to kickstart the economy by distributing money in the hands of workers, right? If it's a demand side crisis, people need more money, and they need jobs, and they need employment. And so, as I say here, this is sometimes called demand management, right? The government spends money, puts it in the hands of people. People then take that money and spend it. That increases the demand for goods, and the economy grows. This kind of Keynesian virtuous cycle. So we had the New Deal, we had social insurance, we had progressive taxation and distribution. The tax rates went up dramatically. Okay, there was all kinds of redistribution, tax the rich, take that money, invest it in jobs, invest it in infrastructure, distribute it to workers. There was the National Labor Relations Act, we already talked about this, unionization, and the expansion of social welfare state. There also was an expansion, obviously, as we went into World War II, of the war economy in particular. During World War II, that is massive amounts of state spending. Lots of people were working around the war economy. Some people describe that as military Keynesianism. It's an interesting concept. And what that means is it's government spending on military armaments and defense, which goes into much of the private sector, defense contractors hiring lots of people, and you, again, have ways of stimulating the economy. Okay, so as we move into the post-World War II period, you're building up this New Deal infrastructure, right? We have what's called the social structure of accumulation. This is just a term to use to describe a period of capitalist expansion, and the capitalist expansion is based on certain institutions, a certain social structure, things which support and facilitate that expansion of capitalism. And so during the post-war period, we talk about the Capital Labor Accord. I've talked about this before. This was we can think of it in relationship to the Treaty of Detroit, right? Capital and labor. They come to some agreement. Capitalists obviously want wages to be as low as possible. But on the other hand, they know that the workers have to have a sufficient amount of money in order to buy the stuff that's being produced. So you have a non-zero-sum logic. A non-zero-sum logic, rather than a capitalist saying, any increase in wages to the worker is a direct cost to me. They say, well, I don't want to raise wages, but on the other hand, raising wages gives workers more money. They turn around and spend that money, and they buy goods that capitalists are producing. So it's not entirely a cost. It's both a cost and a benefit. So you had this kind of agreement, and I think the term that is often used to describe this period as well is the Fordist period. And the Fordist, when people use this term Fordism or Fordist, they're talking about this kind of industrial arrangement between labor and capital during this period, and I think Kalberg makes reference to Fordism. So you have some sense of what they're talking about there. Now, the post-war, when I use the term post-war, that means post-World War II. Today we have endless war, largely instigated by the War on Terror. So a lot of younger students, it's like post-war. There's no such thing as post-war. That's actually true. It really seems that there is no such thing as post. But when we use the term post-war in social science, we're talking post-World War II, right? In the post-World War II economy in the United States, between about 1950 and about 1973, this was the glory years of American capital. This was the most prolific, the most munificent, the most expansive period of capital expansion, growth in our history. Much of the feeling that people have positively about the American economy and upward mobility and all of these kinds of things, and a middle class society, all of that is largely the result of this particular period of time. So you might think, you might ask, maybe capitalism doesn't really work that way. Maybe that was an anomaly. Maybe capitalism is more like what we have today, which is not so kind, generous, not producing upward mobility, producing massive levels of inequality. We're going to get to the reason why that's the case. So, you have the social structure of accumulation during this period. I like to show this. That's, I hope you all know who that is. That's Tricky Dick, or also known as Richard Milhouse Nixon. We used to say Richard Run-of-the-Millhouse Nixon. He was my nemesis as a high school student. I despised him. I hated him with every ounce of my body. Why? Well, it was largely revolving around the Vietnam War and what he did to escalate the Vietnam War. Now, he was a Republican, and he famously said, although there's lots of disputes whenever you attribute a quote to somebody, "We are all Keynesians now," right? Now, Republicans didn't like Keynesian economics. They don't like government intervention. They don't like policies that, give workers the ability to organize. They don't like policies that redistribute income from the rich to, and they also don't like policies that involve expanding the role of the state, agencies, organizations, regulations. But he said, we are all Keynesians. It was almost like it was accepted by both parties that Keynesian economics was pretty much the way the American economy was going to be organized. And by the way, he was a Republican. If he were alive today, he would probably be in the Democratic Party, because there were things he promoted that actually today would be totally opposed by Republicans. Environmental Protection Agency. Think about that. Under Reagan. I'm sorry, under Nixon. Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Under Nixon. Right? So these were important agencies designed to protect the population, protect workers, protect the environment, promoted, supported, advanced by the Republican Richard Nixon. So that gives you some idea of where the Republican Party has gone. But in order to understand that, you have to understand neoliberalism. All right, so during this period, the 70s, the capitalist class was getting a little restive. They were beginning to not be so happy with this New Deal situation. And there's a very important memo. It's called the Powell Memo. This was a presentation to the Chamber of Commerce by Lewis Powell. You can read the whole thing. It's really remarkable. Because in 1971, Powell basically argued with business interests, with corporate interests. He said, we have to organize. There's an attack on the free enterprise system. These people are going to undermine freedom and liberty that he associated with capitalism. So he's, I've highlighted a few points here. The American economic system is under broad attack by progressives, by leftists, by communists, by the new left. He made reference to the new left. We have to press vigorously in all political arenas for support of the enterprise system. That's what they call capitalism. Sounds nicer, free enterprise system. I call it capitalism. Nor should there be reluctance to penalize politically those who oppose what we're doing. Okay. Interesting, right? Penalize politically those who oppose the free enterprise system was a call to arms. Business had to get organized. They had to start acting as a class and promote their class interests. You can read the rest of this. You can also, I think, the Powell Memo there, and purple is the link to the Powell Memo. He became a Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell. Right? But this was a significant call to arms, because what happened after that was that the capitalist class did indeed begin to organize significantly and begin to promote a particular kind of political economic arrangement that deviated from the New Deal, from the Capital Labor Accord, from that social structure of accumulation. So we go into the 1970s, and we begin to see an economic crisis emerging in the 1970s. So after the Great Depression of the 1920s, 1930s, the next major economic crisis in the United States was in the 1970s. Remember, Great Depression, demand-side crisis. The crisis in the 70s, a supply-side crisis. Remember those two different types of crises and what produces them. So this is a supply side crisis. And under the 1970s crisis, the problem was the capitalist class decided that things had gotten out of hand, that the government had expanded too much. Okay? And they basically had four major complaints. Okay? Taxes are too high, regulations are too stringent, unions are too strong, the welfare state is too generous. Taxes, regulations, unions, welfare. Okay? And they decided to disinvest, sometimes called a capital strike, right? Labor strikes by withholding their labor power. Capitalists strike by not investing. They don't invest, we're all screwed. Okay, the economy slows down, there's unemployment, we go into recession. So this occurred during the 1970s. And by doing this, on the one hand, they were creating the economic crisis by virtue of not investing, but also at the same time arguing we're not investing because we don't like the tax rates. We don't like the regulations. We don't like labor unions. They're too strong. They're cutting into our profits. We don't like the welfare state. We don't like people being able to obtain support from the government without having to go out and find a job. Okay. So we move into the 1970s. We see the profits squeeze, capital strike, something called stagflation, where you have both inflation and also recession at the same time. This was a very unusual combination. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's more we could say about stagflation, what caused it. But what was the solution? How do we get out of this crisis? Now remember, it's not a demand-side crisis. The demand-side crisis required Keynesian expansion of government involvement and redistribution. This is a supply-side crisis. And what ultimately emerged, at the beginning, people called it Reaganomics, people called it supply-side economics. Market fundamentalism is another term to describe this. Voodoo economics, a term used by George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. Ultimately, the term is neoliberalism. This became the new political economic social structure of accumulation, organizing the American capitalist political economic system. Neoliberalism, that's the term. It's been in place since the 1980s. And I'm noting here, I never know if this is in your way or not, but if it is, there. Okay, so there's an ideological element to it, and there's a policy element to it. The ideological element is basically markets are better than government. What government does is inefficient, it's unproductive. Markets are efficient and productive. If we have to make a choice, always go with market solutions rather than government solutions. All of you are probably familiar with this. You've all been indoctrinated in the society. If somebody came up to you and said, well, what's the best way to handle this? Should we leave it to the market, or should we let the government try to organize this through some kind of plan? Oh, the market is always much more efficient. So you have this ideological element, anti-government ideological element. And then, of course, you have the policy element, and that is to address those four things which the capitalist class objected to. And that they are not going to invest until they're addressed in some way. And so we see the emergence of a political economic system under Reagan, but extending to the present day, which focuses on those four factors. And one of the things to note here is that everyone knew that the kinds of political economic policies that were being proposed and initiated and enacted by the Reagan administration would inevitably increase the level of inequality. It inevitably would shift resources, income, and wealth upward. Okay? But the point was, the argument was, the way they tried to justify this was, yes, you have to make sure that there is sufficient amount of money in the hands of the capitalist class because they're the ones who invest. And once they see the conditions are favorable, they will make those investments. And wealth and income will trickle down. That was the promise. How did the story end? Let me just get to the punchline. It trickled up. It has continued to trickle up. We now have in the United States, as a result of these policies, the highest level of income and wealth inequality since we've been able to measure it. All right. Trickle-down economics, that's what it's sometimes called. Okay. I didn't want to show both of these, but I will show one now. I will talk about one now. I want to talk about the other one later. So, what does Reagan do? Remember, the complaint is taxes are too high, regulations are too stringent, labor unions are too strong, social welfare is too generous. Reagan went after all four of those things. So you can think of neoliberalism as a set of policies and an ideology designed to roll back the role of government, to regulate, to redistribute, to guarantee the rights of labor, and to provide social welfare benefits. We will talk about Clinton in a moment, okay? So I want to keep going here. So government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Famous quote by Ronald Reagan. I think you understand what he means by that. And of course, there's lots of people that say, oh, Reagan, we need to go back to Reagan Republicanism. And I lived through Reagan's administration, okay? I wouldn't want to go back to that, okay? This glorification of Reagan is due to a historical amnesia. You can see there that Clinton says the era of big government is over. So one of the main points I want to make, and I'm going to say something more about Clinton in a future slide, is that this neoliberal political economic arrangement was bipartisan. Both political parties have supported and advanced this institutional system. So, a few more quotes just to give you the flavor of the way people were speaking as they were trying to introduce this idea of neoliberalism, the ideological side. We had the quote already about the government. The other one that he was famous for, the 10 most dangerous words in English language are, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. By the way, this anti-government ideology translated into the rollback of government responsibility to protect Americans generally, okay, because let the market do it, the market can solve all the problems. Much of the utter, abject failure of the United States to manage the pandemic can be attributed to this ideology and this political economic regime. And Margaret Thatcher was also associated with the rise of neoliberalism right around the same time as Reagan. It's kind of Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal movement. She said there's no such thing as society. Really? I think a sociologist might disagree with that. No such thing as society. Therefore, no such thing as a societal responsibility. No responsibility to society. Just individual men and women. And of course, families. Families are sacred. And she also was famous for Tina. There is no alternative. This political economic regime is the only possible way we can organize the economy. And when you tell people there is no alternative, they begin to believe it. And they think there is no way to transform a system which seems to not be working. Certainly in their economic interest. Okay. Every time I touch this, it throws it off. Okay. All right, so how do we resolve the economic crisis of the 1970s? The institution of neoliberalism, cutting taxes on the rich, cutting regulations, I've already mentioned all of this, forcing more workers into the labor market, etc. And removing restrictions on the mobility of capital. This is very, very important because capital felt that there were restrictions on their ability to shift resources from one place to another, from one geographic location to another. And they wanted to restructure the corporation in fundamental ways. And of course, this gets us closer to making the key connection between the institutionalization of neoliberalism and precarious work. All right. So much of this I've already mentioned the point on the bottom in red. I would just highlight that. Many people, when they hear this term neoliberalism, they think it is referring to something like Democratic Party liberalism. It isn't. When we talk about liberalism here, new liberalism, we're talking about a new form of classical, philosophical, liberal theory, right? When people talk about liberalism in Europe, they're referring to free market, anti-government philosophy. Freedom, liberty from government intrusion, okay? Government involvement, government redistribution, government planning. Okay? That's classical liberal theory. That is a liberalism that is being referred to in the term neoliberalism. So I don't want there to be that level of confusion. Okay, looks like this slide got a little messed up, but that's okay. All right, so what has it produced? We have record income and wealth inequality. We have corporate restructuring, which produced deindustrialization. Say a little bit more about that. In terms of corporate restructuring, outsourcing, that is, corporations begin to decide that many of the activities they're involved in can be done by other entities, other businesses, right? That's outsourcing certain kinds of activity. That shrinks the corporation, shrinks the level of employment. You're outsourcing to lots of firms that are competing with each other for your business. And then ultimately, offshoring. These two things go hand in hand. Outsourcing the manufacturing of goods and having them produced in South China. That's why I have globalization there. It got moved. It was off to the right side, right? Financialization. Greater and greater amounts of economic activity in the United States shift from manufacturing, production, hiring people to produce things that we need, and increasing amounts of capital going into the financial sector. Okay, and remember, we did have the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, which we'll talk about. For Harvey, and if you're interested in reading more about neoliberalism, David Harvey is probably one of the best people to read. You can also check out many of his YouTube presentations. They're fabulous. And basically, he's a neo-Marxist. He's a geographer, anthropologist. And, you know, for him, neoliberalization was from the very beginning, he says, a project to achieve the restoration of class power. Now remember that, the restoration of class power. The capitalist class was complaining about conditions. They felt that they had lost power, that power had shifted to this Keynesian model that involved state intervention and labor unions and redistribution. And it was a political project to reestablish the conditions, right, for capital accumulation. He uses that term. He's a Marxist. And restore the power of economic elites. All right, so under neoliberalism, we had mass deindustrialization. What does this term mean? This has been going on since the 1980s, and essentially means that the manufacturing core in the United States, much of it geographically located, concentrated, the Northeast and the Midwest, you have the deindustrialization. These factories began to shift the location. It's kind of a two-step process. First, they begin to shift their resources from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South. They go to the Sun Belt. And what do they leave behind? What do we call those areas in the Northeast and the Midwest? We call it the Rust Belt. We call it the Rust Belt because it's been abandoned and the factories are empty and it's rusting away and there's not the kind of economic activity there used to be. And if any of you are from the Northeast or the Midwest, or you go through any of those former company towns, places where there was manufacturing, you will see stores closed, high levels of unemployment, all kinds of social pathologies in terms of crime, depression, drug use, etc. The prototype really for this is Detroit, Michigan. That was Motown, that was Motor Town. That's where all the automobile the industry, the businesses that supplied the big three automotive producers. It's totally dead. Or Flint. You could talk about Flint, Michigan as well. Okay, so we had this massive deindustrialization, the first movement to the south, and then ultimately, let's just outsource it to contractors in China or in Mexico. They can produce this stuff. They can produce it cheaply, and again, less and less of what is consumed is produced in the United States. It's produced someplace else. So we've essentially hollowed out our manufacturing industrial core. Union membership goes down dramatically after 1980, and that's because there's an attack on unions. There's less support for ensuring their rights to organize, and that, of course, translates into, as you know, income inequality and wealth inequality. This was a diagram we had talked about last time when we talked about unions, and we talked about the way in which we have seen this period of declining inequality. And notice the declining inequality is during that period I mentioned, from roughly 1950 to the 1970s. That's when you had the lowest level of inequality, lower levels of poverty in the United States. So if you look at the peak in 1929, right, that's around the Great Depression, right? Then you have the institutionalization of all this New Deal legislation. The economy expands, there's all kind of investment, you have the post-war boom of the American economy, and then around 1980, check that out, around 1980 we get a little switch, right? We switch over to this new social structure of accumulation, and you see the levels of inequality rising in a nice trend upward, a nice for the capitalist class. Now, some people have argued that, well, this is happening everywhere. It's inevitable. It happens in the United States. It happens in Europe. It's just the nature of capitalism. And so I just wanted to, let me move my thing there. Okay. I just wanted to show that, in fact, that's not the case. You can see in the United States, the share of national income to the top 1% from 1980 is steadily upward, and the share of national income to the bottom 50% goes steadily down. And at one point, they literally cross. It looks like around 1995. In Europe, you do not see the same thing. You see a slight upward trend for the top 1%, and you see a kind of flattening and maybe a little decline for the bottom 50%. Entirely different pattern. But the important point here is that in the United States, you had instituted the most aggressive form of neoliberal capitalism. So neoliberal capitalism in the United States is much cruder, it's much more aggressive, and therefore you would expect to see different consequences. The other thing we've noticed, because if you take an economics class, they say, well, the amount of money you make, the amount of money that goes to labor is a direct product of their productivity. Well, it's interesting that those two things, and remember there was that Treaty of Detroit. The Treaty of Detroit was the workers would turn over how the workplace was going to be organized to management. We're not going to demand workers' control of the workplace. However, we expect, if we're going to let you, managers, run the joint, organize production, if we're going to let you do that, we expect the resulting productivity to be compensated by increases in hourly wages. Productivity goes up, wages go up. Notice that was pretty much the way the economy worked from 1950 to about 1980. Again, it's 1980. It's not a coincidence that these things happen. And then you see a divergence. Productivity continues to rise. Compensation is flat. And it's been flat since 1980. And this is just another graph that shows that, okay? The number of graphs we can put up here, it gets a little overwhelming. Sometimes students, their eyes glaze over after a while. This is something that is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it tells you what's labor's share of total income, right? How is income distributed between capital and labor? And you can see that, it bounces around during the post-war period, up and down, up and down. And then, again, interestingly, 1980, sharp decline, a few ups and downs, but the secular trend is downward. Again, let's make the connection between the political economic system of neoliberalism and its impact on workers and work and compensation. This is one of my favorite little images. Remember, I told you that the justification for all this was, well, eventually the income will, trickle down. It trickled up. And here they are. The joke is on us. And you can see Reagan on the left. You can see George H.W. Bush, the second from the right, and the rest of the other. There's a term I would use to describe this group of people, but I'm going to withhold that comment because I've been a little harsh lately in some of my commentaries, so I don't want to alienate people. It's quite a cabal. Okay, point I want to make. Okay, you have Reagan. You have one term by George H.W. Bush. That was the last one-term president till Trump. Okay, but what about Clinton? Clinton comes in as a Democrat, right? Democrats are supposed to be, pro New Deal, and the New Deal was a Democratic set of policies. Democratic Party was closely connected to labor. Well, Clinton comes in and basically normalizes, regularizes, makes acceptable neoliberalism. And I'm pointing here to three major pieces of legislation. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which labor and people on the left and all progressives strongly opposed. They didn't want a free trade agreement, particularly with Mexico, because it would inevitably have American workers competing with Mexican workers for jobs, and it would make it easier for businesses to shift their resources south of the border to take advantage of the low wages, the lax environmental regulations, and everything else. But NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was advanced, pushed, promoted, and ultimately signed by Bill Clinton. What I want you to notice here is look at the way in which both Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate supported all of these pieces of legislation. And to me, these are three major pieces of legislation that reflect neoliberal sensibilities. The second was his Welfare Reform Act. By the way, if this Welfare Reform Act had been proposed by a Republican, there would have been massive levels of objection to it because it was pushing people off the rolls. Go out and get a job. You're not going to get any benefits until you find a job, look for a job. Work fair over welfare. Personal responsibility. Work opportunity. You can just tell by the language here. Okay? Some people in his administration actually resigned as a result of his passing this. They thought it was a total betrayal to the social welfare legacy of the Democratic Party. In any case, notice that in the Senate and the House you had large numbers, people from both parties. You don't see this anymore. That's what I mean by bipartisan support for the neoliberal program. And then you have the rollback of the regulations on the financial sector. This was the most significant rollback, deregulation of the financial sector since the New Deal. And I can tell you that the results of this deregulation was the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008. This deregulation of the financial sector allowed banks and investment firms to engage in activities which at one time were restricted because they were damaging to the larger economy. Clinton and his associates, Alan Greenspan, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, they all advocated this kind of deregulation. And the results have been nothing but negative. Okay, repeal of Glass-Steagall. That's one of the major parts of that legislation that took place under Clinton. So Clinton is, a neoliberal. Okay. Now, why was there no demand side crisis? Because remember, what I said was that people have to have enough money to buy all the stuff, or you're going to have a demand side crisis, right? And so you saw that the capacity to produce now is really good, right? You got low wages, unions are weak, taxes are low, regulations are minimal. This is great for the capacity to produce, but what about the capacity to consume? You still have to sell the stuff that you're producing. How can you keep the capitalist economy going through the 80s and the 90s and then through the 2000s if wages are flat? All right. Well, this takes us to how did workers and families manage? Juliet Schor. You will read something by Juliet Schor later. Great, great economist. By the way, she got her degree at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I got my sociology degree. Wonderful institution. Go Minutemen. I think the Minutemen thing is probably going to create some problems at some point. Okay, anyway. The Overworked American. Great book. Her point was workers are working longer than they ever have before. If your wages aren't going up, you take on extra work. You work longer compared to other societies at the same level of economic development. In European countries, Americans work longer and they have more jobs. They work more hours. They are overworked. She says the unexpected decline of leisure, right? Because at one time people said, well, as society becomes more advanced and more developed and we have new technologies, there will be more time for leisure. Sorry, didn't work out. Here's a book written by Elizabeth Warren. Everyone knows Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, before she got involved in running for president and became senator of Massachusetts, she was an academic and she wrote massive amounts of great research studies, conducted research studies, wrote these books reporting on the struggles of the average working family and the two-income trap. What do you do? Well, I guess both people are going to have to work to keep up because wages are flat, costs are still going up. We still have to pay rent. We have to pay for all the amenities, the requirements, and maybe we want a couple of luxury goods. Two paycheck families. Okay, so these are ways in which workers adapted to the difficulties they were facing under neoliberalism, and of course, while they're doing this, they're making a little more money, right? Sort of keeping the demand up, although at a cost to them and their time. No leisure, more work. And then, of course, the most important factor that maintained the system as long as it did before we saw the big crash in 2007, 2008 was private debt. People used credit cards. And the most significant factor was when housing prices went up, okay, there was a housing bubble. And people owned homes, and because the price of their home was increasing, the value of their home was increasing, they would take out home equity lines of credit and use the value of their home as collateral. And lots of people were taking out mortgages and etc., even though they weren't making enough money necessarily to support the kinds of payments they would have to make. All of this stuff is coming together. All of the financial disaster that took place in 2007, 2008 can be directly attributed to the economic deprivation and the need for people to take on debt. Okay, some people say credit. Credit is essentially debt. And here you see this is debt service ratio in relationship to your income, and you can see that through the 90s and into the 2000s, it's going up. Something has to give. This is sometimes called privatized Keynesianism. Think about that concept. Privatized Keynesianism. Normally, when we think about Keynesian policies, we think about the government pumping, right, public money pumped into the economy to stimulate it, put money in the hands of workers so they can go out and spend it and generate demand, which then increases hiring and expanding because businesses have more customers, etc., right? So this is privatized Keynesianism. What that means is you have the same effect stimulated by debt, okay? People borrow money, they take out a home equity line of credit, and they use that to purchase things because their wages aren't sufficient to cover the costs. And so we have a kind of Keynesian effect, but it's produced by private debt. This is the theoretical model. I'm going to say more about this next week because I am going to return to the book by Kalberg. But again, I want you to understand the relationship between the macro, the meso, and the micro. Okay? And when we want to analyze things in an intellectually sophisticated fashion, as I've said many times, we have to make these connections. And the connection I'm trying to make is at the macro level, the very macro level. And that is, how is the political economic system organized? And it is currently neoliberalism. And how has that affected the meso level, corporate restructuring, okay, which I made reference to? We'll talk about more next week as well. And ultimately, how does corporate restructuring then in turn affect the experiences of individual workers and their well-being? Right? So macro, meso, micro. Levels of analysis and levels of connection. When you can start thinking this way, you have moved to a higher level of intellectual power. And you can talk about things differently. And you can impress your friends with your knowledge and a level of sophistication. Financialization was a big part of the story, and this is discussed as well in Kalberg's book, Financial Profits as a Percent of Total Domestic Product. More and more money. Think about the massive amounts of profit that the corporations are making during this period, because remember, wages are low and stagnant, labor is weak, redistribution is minimal, taxes are low, there are fewer regulations. All of this produces mega profits. What do they do with all these profits? This is the key point to keep in mind, because often people say, well, you know, if you just put more money in the hands of the capitalist class, or they think that they will make higher profits with the money that they have to invest, it'll create more jobs, more opportunities. That's the trickle-down idea. But that's not necessarily the case. That is, these profits can be hoarded. They can take the profits and use it to distribute bonuses to all their cronies. All their cronies on the board, the high-level managers and CEOs within these corporations. Or they can say, you know what? I could, build another factory in a community that needs jobs, income, some level of economic stimulus. Or, as a rational capitalist, I'm going to put my money where I can get the highest return. And the financial sector, because it had been deregulated, was creating all kinds of exotic instruments designed to attract all that money that was being concentrated in the corporate coffers. And you see more and more of the profit in the United States generated by the financial sector rather than production, rather than manufacturing, rather than industry. This doesn't serve the public well. And in terms of employment, you see sharp levels of decline for manufacturing, of course. This is part of the deindustrialization. And notice finance, the level of employment is quite flat because it's not labor intensive. And so just think about this in terms of inequality. People making massive amounts of money on Wall Street, but not large numbers of people, and their fortunes get bigger and bigger, especially if they're running some of these hedge funds, right? Or they're bond traders making lots of money. You go over to the business school, you ask the students, where do you want to work? Oh, I want to work in the financial sector, right? rather than, working in management, organizing production. So this is going to accentuate inequality because you're concentrating large amounts of income and benefits and wealth in the hands of a relatively small number within the financial sector. All right, so I want to finish up by saying something about shareholder value. This is a concept that was elevated to a principle in business schools and in corporate suites. And the idea is that what is the obligation of corporations? Right? Under neoliberalism, there began to be a sharp switch, and this is again part of the neoliberal ideology. The corporation only has one obligation, one objective, one mission. That is to serve its shareholders and to increase shareholder value. That is not the way people historically have thought about the role of the corporation. They thought the role of the corporation, there's some social responsibility. There are stakeholders, not just shareholders, people who own the stock. But there was this total shift. Some of this is associated with Milton Friedman, who's one of the economic philosophers and theorists of neoliberalism. And his view was corporations have no obligation to do anything other than maximize profit, period. And maximize profit as a way to ensure that they serve their shareholders. And during this time, there was this discussion of the separation of ownership and control. Shareholders own the company. Managers control it. Okay? Managers are hired to run the company. And so this created this agency, what's called the agency problem, the agency theory problem. And that is, and I think I've made some reference to this earlier in the semester, you have principals and you have agents. Okay? Principals, shareholders, agents, those people you put in charge to represent your interests. The agency problem is that can the people who own the corporation and own the stock, can they trust those agents, those managers to do the right thing, to behave in the right way, to maximize shareholder value? Because, managers might have learned in business school that, there are other stakeholders. Like we have to worry about the concerns of the community. We can't be shifting the factory from one location to another if it's going to destroy a community. Well, shareholders don't care about that. That's all they care about is how much profit the corporation is making and what is the stock price. Right? So in order to get around this problem, you hired managers and you gave them stock options. You understand? So a manager is hired, let's say he's hired for $150,000 a year, and he's given, 1,000 shares of stock in the corporation he works for. Now you have a way of sort of controlling his behavior, because he may not be doing things he would have done before, because now he's thinking about the fact that his compensation is directly related to the share price, the stock price. And Wall Street responds favorably when companies do things to cut costs and maximize profit. So we had shareholder value became the model that corporations were using, and devastating effects. So you had a shift in managerial objectives. This is based on the work of William Lazonick. If you're interested in reading anything about this, shareholder value, the crisis of shareholder value, his work is indispensable. He said at one time it was retain and reinvest your profits. You retain them, you hang on to them, and you reinvest them in new production, expansion, employment. He said we've had a shift from retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute. What does he mean by distribute? He doesn't mean distribute the profits to workers. He means distribute it to the shareholders. Make the corporation smaller, leaner, more profitable, even though you're going to create unemployment and devastate communities, doesn't matter. Remember, And I don't want to vilify the capital. They're doing this because it's rational. It's rational for them to engage in whatever behavior will maximize profit. So if you want to understand the problem, don't vilify the corporation. Understand they're operating within an economic system which encourages them to do this. So you have the rise of finance, pressure restructuring corporations, because as you restructure corporations, Wall Street responds favorably, and you have this kind of cycle. And let me just, whoops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to move this down a little bit if I can, and I don't think I can. Okay, never mind. All right. So at the bottom, I wanted to move the frame that records this. It says downsize, outsource, offshore. Those are the three things that were taking place. Down, out, off. None of those sound very good. Those were all managerial strategies rewarded by, I don't know if you can see this, Wall Street investors. Downsizing, outsourcing, offshoring, Wall Street investors like that. It drove up the stock price. And of course, if managers are holding a lot of the stock, they are positively reinforced financially for those decisions. All right, and this is kind of the relationship between these things that I've highlighted before. And I want you simply to look at, and we've basically talked about all of these things. The Nikification of the corporation is simply the total downsizing and outsourcing. And the reason it's Nikification is, after Nike manufactures and produces no sneakers. You understand? There's lots of corporations that fall into this Nikification category. They produce no sneakers. They do research, development, design, and marketing. And they slap the logo, which creates a lot of the value. All of the production is outsourced and offshored to subcontractors in Asia, primarily Asia. That's why we call it a factoryless corporation. There's no factories. And their profits are not invested back in production. Look, they're making massive amounts of profit. Are they going to plow it back into? They don't own any factories. What are they going to do with their profits? Right? They're going to reward themselves, reward their shareholders, invested in various instruments on Wall Street, financialization. And buy back their stock. This is something that's happening all the time. A lot of Americans don't realize this. These massive amounts of profit that these corporations have, which some people say they have to have profit in order for capitalism to expand, because with that profit, they're going to invest it in new employment and new jobs and new factories. They use those profits to buy back shares of their stock, demand for the stock, which ensures that the price will either go up or at least retain its value. Do a little research on stock buybacks. All right. So, the 2007-2008 crisis that we had was to some extent exacerbated by the conditions that prevented it from occurring in the first place. You understand? In other words, neoliberal policy is instituted. It looks like workers are getting squeezed. How did they survive? Well, one of the main forces that they survived, and which essentially forestalled the emergence of the demand-side crisis, was debt. Debt. I'll take on debt. I'll use that to live, to spend, to buy, to cover the cost of what I need. Well, that meant that the demand-side crisis didn't hit in the 90s, and it didn't hit in the early 2000s, but eventually the debt burden climbed and climbed and climbed. You had the housing bubble, and it all burst. And the crisis was worse by virtue of the factors that prevented it from emerging earlier. Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist, had enormous impact on Marxist theory, theorizing, strategy. political sociology. The old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. In the interim, a great variety of morbid symptoms will occur. We'll talk more about those morbid symptoms. All right, I'm going to stop there. There is more to this lecture. I want to say a little more about the economic crisis itself and the fact that when Obama came in office during that crisis period, what happened. What I will tell you is, just so you understand, Obama continued the neoliberal political economic model. He did not fundamentally change the political economic system, structures, institutions that gave rise to the massive levels of inequality. And to some extent, I would argue, I'll talk more about this next week, this laid the groundwork for Trump and Trumpism. So for the moment, I wanted you to get this background on what neoliberalism is, how it emerged, what the consequences of it are, and as you're reading the first chapter of Kalberg, he makes reference, obviously, to this broader political economic environment, and now hopefully you have a better understanding of that so that you can link it to his discussion of precarious work and ultimately precarious lives. All right. Thanks for your attention. Let me see if I can stop this.